The world had changed overnight. One minute, the city was a bustling metropolis, alive with the hum of traffic and the chatter of everyday life. The next, it was a ghost town, silent and deserted except for the groans of the undead and the sound of footsteps echoing in the streets. A deadly virus had spread, turning people into flesh-eating monsters, and the survivors were left to fend for themselves in a world that no longer recognized them. In the midst of the chaos, a family, father, mother, and 2 children, found themselves holed up in their small apartment in the heart of the city. The father, Daniel, had always been the protector. He was the one who made sure the family was safe, who made the tough decisions. His wife, Sarah, was the calm in the storm, keeping the children grounded amidst the terror that was all around them. Their daughter, Emily, was 10, full of energy and curiosity, though she had become quieter since the outbreak. Their son, Ben, was 6, the most vulnerable, who often clung to his mother, his eyes wide with fear. They had not planned for this, no one had. There had been whispers about a virus, but no one took it seriously until it was too late. By the time they realized what was happening, the city was already under siege. Panic spread faster than the disease, and soon, entire neighborhoods had been abandoned. The undead roamed the streets, their growls filling the air. Every day was a fight for survival. It had been 3 days since they last ventured outside. The family had barricaded themselves inside their apartment, relying on what little food they had left. Daniel had scavenged the neighboring buildings, risking his life each time he stepped into the open air, but their supplies were dwindling. The windows were covered with sheets of heavy cloth to block out any light or sound, making the apartment feel more like a tomb than a home. As the day wore on, the oppressive silence began to weigh on them. Sarah and Daniel sat in the dimly lit living room, whispering in hushed tones. Their voices were barely audible, as if speaking too loudly might alert the undead to their presence. "How long do you think we can keep this up?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking slightly. She glanced at the children, who were sitting on the floor, playing a quiet game of cards. Emily had grown more withdrawn since the outbreak, her once vibrant spirit dulled by the constant fear of the world outside. "We'll keep going until we have no other choice," Daniel replied, his jaw tight with determination. "We can't risk going outside unless it's absolutely necessary. We'll wait for the military, for help. There has to be something out there." But Sarah wasn't so sure. The days of hearing about military plans on the radio had long since passed. The government had declared martial law, but it was clear that it hadn't been enough to stop the spread of the virus. The city had fallen. No one was coming. The silence in the room grew heavier as night began to fall. Outside, the streets were eerily quiet, but they knew better than to assume everything was calm. The undead were unpredictable. Sometimes they gathered in small packs, shuffling aimlessly down streets. Other times, they moved in hordes, drawn to the smallest sound. "Shoo!" Ben suddenly whispered, his little finger pressed to his lips as he looked up at his parents. His eyes were wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. Emily looked up from her cards, her brow furrowed. "What is it, Ben?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben's eyes darted nervously toward the window, and his small body tensed, as if he was sensing something his older sister could not. He had been acting strange lately, more intuitive than usual. Sarah and Daniel exchanged a glance, both of them trying to keep calm. "Just stay quiet," Daniel whispered, moving toward the window cautiously. He peered through the heavy fabric covering the glass. It was dark outside, but there was a faint, flickering light, like the shadow of something moving. "Do you hear that?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The sound of distant footsteps echoed faintly, coming closer. The family froze. They had learned to recognize the sounds of the undead. The slow, dragging footsteps, the faint groans. But this was different. It wasn't a single walker, it was something else. Something faster. Sarah's heart raced. She motioned for the children to stay still, her eyes never leaving Daniel. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Daniel replied, his hand instinctively going to the bat he kept by the door. But we can't take any chances. The sound grew louder, closer. Panic began to rise in Sarah's chest as the realization hit her, they weren't alone. The silence they had fought so hard to maintain had been shattered, and now they were in danger. The question was, how long would they be able to hide before they were found? The family waited in terrified silence, listening to the growing noise outside, praying it wasn't the end of their fragile existence. The faint sound of footsteps grew louder, and the tension in the apartment was palpable. The family had been as quiet as they possibly could, but with every passing moment, it felt as though the slightest movement would give them away. Daniel gripped his bat tightly, eyes scanning the dark room for any sign of the danger that was closing in. The sound was unmistakable now. There was no mistaking the heavy thud of shuffling feet and the occasional low growl, a sound that made Sarah's stomach turn with fear. She tightened her grip around Ben, who was clutching her side, his little hands trembling. Emily, ever the observant one, stared intently at the door, her face pale but determined. "Stay down," Daniel whispered urgently, pressing his finger to his lips, signaling for everyone to remain silent. He could feel the cold sweat dripping down his back as his heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct told him to run, to fight back, but he knew that wouldn't help. The undead weren't like anything they had ever faced before. Their numbers were too great, their senses too sharp. Escape wasn't always possible. The footsteps outside continued to draw closer, but there was something else, something more ominous. There was the faint sound of something scraping against the wall, a desperate, jagged noise that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was as though something, or someone, was looking for a way in. "Please, no," she whispered under her breath. Her eyes darted to the makeshift barricade at the door, nothing more than a few sturdy chairs and a small bookshelf wedged tightly against it. It wouldn't hold against any real force. They were running out of time. The light flickered on and off, casting long shadows across the walls, making the already claustrophobic apartment feel even smaller. The creeping realization that they might not make it out of this alive began to set in, but Daniel refused to let it show. They couldn't give in to fear. "Mom, I'm scared," Ben whispered, his voice breaking the silence. Sarah bent down to his level, her voice gentle yet firm. "I know, sweetie. But we're going to stay quiet, and we're going to stay safe. We'll get through this, okay?" Ben nodded, but his wide eyes betrayed his fear. Emily, on the other hand, sat perfectly still, her lips pressed tight. She wasn't crying or speaking, but the tension in her small body was unmistakable. She understood the gravity of the situation. "Shoo," Daniel motioned for everyone to be still. He pressed his ear against the door, trying to discern the exact location of the threat. The scraping noise had stopped, but the footsteps were still there. A slow, rhythmic shuffle, as though the creature outside was methodically searching each building. The air in the room felt thick with dread. Sarah felt as though she might suffocate from the tension. She couldn't remember the last time they'd laughed or had a normal conversation. The world had become a place where survival was the only thought on anyone's mind. She thought about her family's life before everything changed, before the virus, before the undead, and a hollow sadness filled her chest. Suddenly, there was a loud bang against the barricade. The entire apartment trembled with the force of it, and the noise cut through the silence like a knife. Daniel's heart leaped in his throat, and he scrambled back instinctively. The sound of heavy footsteps grew louder, and now, there was no denying it, something was right outside their door. "Get down," Daniel hissed. His voice was a low growl, his eyes wide with panic as he pulled the children closer to him. His mind raced, weighing his options. They could try to fight, but he knew they were outnumbered and unprepared for a confrontation. The risk was too high. No, they needed to remain hidden. Sarah and the children crouched down beneath the kitchen counter, hoping their small bodies would be concealed enough to avoid detection. Ben's breathing was ragged, the fear radiating off of him in waves. Emily, ever the quiet one, kept her eyes fixed on her father. She knew what was at stake. The door creaked, and the sound of slow, shuffling steps drew nearer. Something, or someone, was leaning against the barricade, testing its strength. It was only a matter of time before the undead would breach their meager defenses. "We need a plan," Daniel whispered, his voice strained. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, his thoughts a jumbled mess. They couldn't afford to stay hidden forever. Eventually, the creatures would find them. But there was no way they could outrun them in this city. Every street was filled with danger. "Daniel," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "What if we don't make it out of here? What if this is it?" "We will," Daniel said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "We will get out. We just need to wait for the right moment." But as the barricade began to creak under the pressure of the undead, Daniel knew that their time was running out. He could feel the weight of his family's survival on his shoulders. If they were going to escape, they had to do it now. The door cracked open, just enough for a cold, rotting hand to slip through. The unmistakable stench of decay filled the air. The cold, rotting hand groped through the small crack in the door, its fingers scraping against the wood with a grotesque, unnerving sound. The air was thick with dread, every breath the family took felt heavier than the last. The undead outside were so close, Daniel could almost hear their ragged, gurgling breaths. "Stay down," Daniel whispered fiercely, his voice strained with the effort to remain calm. He could feel the heat of panic rising in his chest, but he knew that if he lost his composure, his family would too. His eyes scanned the room quickly, searching for any means of escape. They were trapped. Ben, still clinging to his mother, let out a barely audible whimper, his small body trembling against her. Emily, always the more composed of the two children, was staring at the door, her face pale but focused. Sarah's hand rested gently on Ben's shoulder, trying to comfort him, but her own heart was racing. Daniel's thoughts raced. He could feel the undead outside inching closer, their hollow moans growing louder. The barricade was weak, and the door was no longer going to hold much longer. He needed a plan, something, anything, to give them a chance. "Mom, I'm scared," Ben whispered again, this time louder, his fear bubbling over. "I know, baby," Sarah whispered back, her voice tight, "but we're going to be okay. We just need to be quiet." Daniel's gaze flicked toward the window. It was covered, but he could see faint outlines of the streetlights outside. He strained to listen for any sign of movement. The last thing he wanted to do was risk opening it, but if they were going to escape, they needed a way out. The shuffling noises grew louder. There were more of them, moving in and out of the narrow alley, seemingly drawn to the apartment by the faint sounds they were making. Daniel could hear their groans, the low, hungry moans of the undead that filled him with a chilling sense of urgency. He turned back to his family. "We have to go now," he said firmly, his voice low but resolute. Sarah's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "We can't just leave, Daniel. They're right outside." "I know," Daniel replied, his jaw set with determination. "But we can't stay here. We have to find another way out of the building, maybe head to the back alley. If we make it to the street, we have a chance." Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "How do we know it's safe out there?" "We don't," Daniel said honestly. "But we don't have any other options. If we stay here, we'll be sitting ducks." The sound of the undead outside grew even closer, their dragging footsteps coming from both directions now. There was no more time to waste. Daniel looked around quickly, mentally mapping out an escape route. He glanced at the kitchen, the only place they could move to without being seen by the undead outside. But the alley, the back exit, was their best shot. "Okay, here's the plan," Daniel whispered. "We'll head for the kitchen, and then through the back door. Stay close to me. Keep as quiet as possible. If we can make it to the alley, we'll head for the nearest safe house. Do you understand?" The children nodded, fear still visible in their eyes, but they trusted him. "We can do this," Sarah whispered, although she wasn't sure if she believed it. Her grip tightened on Ben's hand as she pulled him closer. Daniel took one last look at the barricaded door. The undead were trying to force it open. There wasn't much time left. The room seemed to shrink around them, the walls closing in as the family prepared to make their move. "Stay close," Daniel said one last time, his voice a sharp command. He knew there was no room for hesitation now. The family crouched low to the ground, moving as quietly as possible. Sarah held Ben tightly, the child's small form pressed against her, while Emily followed closely behind. Daniel led the way, his eyes scanning every corner of the room. Every step they took was careful, deliberate, knowing that even the slightest sound could draw the attention of the undead. They reached the kitchen without incident, and Daniel quickly checked the back door. It was locked, but there was no time to be gentle. With one swift motion, he broke the lock with the butt of the bat and swung the door open just a crack, peering into the alley beyond. The coast seemed clear, for now. "Let's go," he whispered urgently. They slipped through the door, the cool night air hitting their faces. It was eerily quiet, but they knew the undead weren't far behind. Daniel motioned for them to move quickly. The alley was narrow, and every corner could hide a threat. They had to get to the main street. There were rumors of survivors hiding in nearby safe houses, and that was their only hope. The family moved quickly, staying low, trying to make themselves as invisible as possible. The silence of the night pressed in on them, broken only by the distant growls of the undead as they roamed the city. It was strange. How could the world feel so alive with danger and yet so still? As they neared the street, Daniel's heart hammered in his chest. They could see the faint glow of the streetlights up ahead. They were so close. But just as they were about to turn the corner, a loud crash echoed behind them. A door slammed open. Daniel spun around, his heart skipping a beat. Something was coming. The crash echoed through the alley, its sharp sound reverberating off the walls. Daniel's heart raced as he whipped his head around, eyes scanning the darkened corridor behind them. He hadn't seen anything, but the unmistakable sound of shuffling footsteps and low, guttural moans sent a chill down his spine. The undead were coming. "Run!" Daniel hissed, his voice desperate, low, but urgent. He didn't need to say it twice. Sarah grabbed Ben's hand, pulling him close as she began to sprint forward, Emily right behind her. Daniel hesitated only for a moment, his eyes darting back and forth as he ensured no one had been left behind. The alley was tight, the shadows long, and the narrow path felt like a trap, but there was no time to turn back. Every instinct screamed at Daniel to push forward, to get his family to safety. But the terror of the approaching undead made his thoughts scatter, and the city, now a cold, twisted version of its former self, seemed to close in on them. "Stay close," Daniel shouted, trying to keep his voice steady. He reached for Emily, who was keeping pace but was visibly anxious, her face pale under the dim light. "Keep moving, just a little farther." Emily nodded, fear dancing in her eyes, but she didn't stop. They couldn't afford to stop. The darkness pressed in, and Daniel could hear the sounds of pursuit growing louder. From behind them, the first of the undead staggered into the alley. Its disjointed movements were accompanied by a low, rasping breath, and its skin, once human, was now mottled and decayed. Its empty, clouded eyes locked on the family, its hands clawing the air as it began to shuffle toward them. The moment of terror hit hard. Daniel's eyes locked onto the undead as it came closer, and a wave of dread surged through him. They couldn't outrun them forever. But they had to try. "Faster!" Daniel urged, his voice breaking. The undead were relentless. And there were more. He could hear them behind the first, more shuffling bodies, their hungry moans becoming more distinct. They reached the end of the alley, and Daniel's eyes flicked quickly to the street. The nearest safe house should be a few blocks away. He had memorized the path, but they were too exposed. He had no choice. "Through the door!" Daniel shouted, and Sarah didn't hesitate. She dashed toward a nearby abandoned building, its broken door slightly ajar, a potential refuge. But as Sarah reached for the door, a new wave of terror hit, the unmistakable sound of more undead, this time from the opposite direction. A low growl filled the alley as a group of them emerged from the shadows, blocking the way. There was no escape. "Daniel!" Sarah called, her voice full of panic. "What do we do now?" Daniel's mind raced. He couldn't let his family be trapped. He scanned their surroundings in desperation. There had to be a way out. As he turned back to Sarah, his eyes landed on a fire escape ladder near the building's wall, just within reach. Up! We go up! Daniel shouted. Without thinking, he ran toward the base of the ladder, pulling it down with one swift motion. Sarah and Emily hesitated for a moment, fear holding them back. But they trusted him. Ben, too young to fully understand the danger, clung to his mother, terrified but compliant. Come on. Now. Daniel urged, looking over his shoulder to see the growing horde of undead drawing nearer. The sound of dragging feet, snarls, and guttural growls filled the alley as the creatures closed in on them. There was no time. One by one, they climbed the ladder, Daniel leading the way. He held Ben in his arms as Sarah climbed next, then Emily. The ladder creaked under their combined weight, but they kept moving. Daniel could hear the moans of the undead growing louder, echoing off the alley walls. He didn't dare look back. When they reached the rooftop, Daniel's legs burned from the effort, but there was no time to catch his breath. He looked around. The rooftops of the nearby buildings stretched out before them, dark and foreboding. From this height, they could see the sprawling city below, streets now empty except for the wandering undead that filled every corner. Where do we go now? Sarah whispered, her voice shaking with exhaustion and fear. Her eyes flicked nervously from the street below to the horizon, where the dark, roiling mass of the undead still filled the city. Keep moving, Daniel said. We'll find a way through. There's a block of apartments up ahead. We can try to make it there. But even as he spoke, the horror of their situation settled deep in his bones. They had made it to the rooftops, but the city was vast, filled with danger at every turn. They weren't safe, not yet. Not by a long shot. We have to keep going, Daniel urged, more to himself than anyone else. He couldn't stop. Not now. The family moved across the rooftops, trying to stay low and out of sight, but every time they passed an open area, their hearts raced. The undead below shuffled aimlessly, drawn by the slightest sound, and Daniel knew they couldn't afford to make any noise. But as they moved, they heard something else, the sound of voices. At first, Daniel thought it was just his imagination, but then, faintly, he heard the unmistakable sound of human voices, low, urgent whispers. Could there be other survivors? Shoo! Daniel said urgently. He pulled Sarah close, motioning for her to listen. The voices grew louder. He couldn't tell where they were coming from, but the sound of human voices was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it meant there were others out there, perhaps a group of survivors. But on the other hand, they had no idea who they were or whether they could be trusted. Stay quiet, Daniel whispered. Let's find out who they are. And with that, they made their way toward the source of the voices, every step taking them deeper into the unknown. To be continued. The voices grew clearer as Daniel and his family crouched behind an abandoned air conditioning unit on the rooftop. Every movement they made seemed to echo in the otherwise eerie silence of the night. The city was still, save for the low groans of the undead and the occasional scuffle of their dragging feet. Stay quiet, Daniel whispered again, his breath shallow. His mind raced. He hadn't expected to find anyone else. The city had felt so empty, so alone. Now, there were voices, there were survivors nearby. But what kind of survivors? How many? Sarah squeezed his hand, her face pale but determined. Emily and Ben stood beside her, wide-eyed, still processing the gravity of the situation. They were all terrified, but Daniel's calm composure helped keep them grounded, even if his own heart was pounding in his chest. The voices continued, low but unmistakable. Two distinct tones, one male, one female, were speaking in hurried, hushed whispers. We can't stay here much longer. It's only a matter of time before they find us. The male voice was deep, with an edge of frustration. We need to find a way out of this district. The alleyways are crawling with them, the female voice responded, her words sharp, her fear barely concealed. Daniel strained to hear more, his mind working overtime. The fact that these people were still alive meant they were resourceful, but desperate too. They must have been hiding for a while, just like he and his family had. "Should we approach them?" Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on Daniel. There was a flicker of hope in her gaze. Maybe these strangers could help. Daniel's lips pressed into a tight line. Trust was something he couldn't afford right now. But they couldn't stay hidden forever, not on this rooftop. The undead were everywhere, and they had barely escaped the alley. He knew they had to make contact, but cautiously. "No," Daniel replied quietly, his voice full of determination. "We'll wait until they move. We can follow them from a safe distance. Let's see where they're going." He motioned for the family to stay down, and they did, huddling close together. For a few moments, the only sound was the distant groaning of the undead and the harsh breath of the family as they waited. The quiet stretched on, unnervingly still. Then, the voices broke the silence again. "We can't trust anyone. You heard what happened to those people last week. They let them in," and the male voice's words were cut off by a sudden noise, a sharp clatter from below. The family tensed, hearts in their throats. "What was that?" the female voice hissed. Daniel's heart skipped. Could they have been discovered? Were the undead nearby? He peeked over the edge of the rooftop, his eyes searching the street below. Nothing. The male voice cursed under his breath. Just a trash can. Damn things, always making noise. Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. But then, a new noise reached his ears, another shuffle. Closer this time. Louder. The undead. "Move now!" Daniel hissed, his voice urgent. The family scrambled to their feet as he grabbed Sarah's arm and yanked her to the side. They needed to leave the rooftop immediately. But before they could take another step, the voices below shifted. The strangers had started moving, likely trying to find a safer location as well. Daniel saw them for the first time, two figures, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter, more compact. The man was holding a crowbar, the woman a baseball bat. Both were covered in grime, their clothes ragged but practical. They were survivors. "Follow them," Daniel whispered to Sarah. "Stay low and quiet. We can't risk them spotting us." The family moved quickly, following the strangers at a cautious distance. Daniel's eyes never left them, watching for any sudden moves or signs of aggression. He didn't trust easily, not anymore. Not after what had happened in the earlier days of the outbreak, when desperation had led to betrayal. But there was something in these two, an urgency, a focused determination, that made him think they might be different. The group of strangers led them through the maze of rooftops, over creaky metal stairwells, and down narrow alleyways, staying close to the buildings to avoid being seen. The undead were everywhere, but they moved with practiced precision, staying out of the open. Minutes turned to hours as the group slowly made their way through the city, navigating back streets and hidden paths. Daniel was starting to wonder where they were headed when the woman finally turned, catching a glimpse of them from the corner of her eye. She froze. Daniel's heart skipped a beat as their gazes locked. For a brief moment, it felt like time stood still. Then, the woman's expression shifted from suspicion to cautious acknowledgement. "You followed us," she said, her voice steady but weary. Daniel stepped forward, keeping his family behind him. "We didn't mean to. We're just trying to survive." The man with the crowbar turned slowly, eyeing Daniel and the others carefully. He didn't say anything at first, his face unreadable. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the weight of uncertainty. "You're lucky we didn't notice you earlier," the man finally spoke, his tone dry. "The city's dangerous, more so than you probably realize." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "We've seen what the city can do." The woman stepped forward, glancing at the man. "You got a name?" she asked, her voice softer now, but still wary. "Daniel," he replied. "This is Sarah, Emily, and Ben. We're just trying to make it through. We didn't know who you were, but we had to follow. We needed to know if there were other survivors." The man looked them over carefully, as though sizing them up. there's more of us. We've been holed up in a shelter for the last few weeks, but it's not safe anymore. We're moving out tonight. Where are you going? Sarah asked, her voice hopeful but cautious. To a safer place, the woman replied cryptically, her eyes scanning the surroundings. It's not perfect, but it's better than this. Daniel exchanged a look with Sarah. It was a risk, but they couldn't stay out here any longer. The undead were closing in, and they needed shelter. For Ben's sake, they couldn't afford to hesitate. We'll go with you, Daniel said, his voice firm. But we need to move now. The woman nodded. Then let's get moving. The two strangers, unexpected allies, led the family deeper into the maze of the city, toward what they hoped would be a safer future, but the shadow of danger loomed over them all. To be continued. The city's skyline loomed over them, a silhouette of broken buildings and abandoned streets. As they followed the strangers, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The empty city had always felt like a trap, a place that no longer welcomed the living. The silence was suffocating, punctuated only by the occasional groan of the undead or the rustling of trash as the wind blew through the desolate streets. They moved quickly but quietly, staying low as they navigated through narrow back alleys and down forgotten side streets. The man with the crowbar led the way, his every step cautious, his eyes scanning every corner. The woman was a few paces behind him, her baseball bat ready, her posture tense but alert. Daniel's family kept close together, with Ben holding tightly to Sarah's hand. Emily's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but she said nothing. She knew better than to speak out of turn, her silence speaking volumes. Daniel felt a pang of guilt as he watched her, wishing there was more he could do to shield her from the horrors they'd all been forced to endure. The group moved through the city like ghosts, the ruins around them whispering the stories of the people who once lived there. Every broken window and overturned car felt like a reminder of the lives that had been ripped apart by the undead. Yet, despite the destruction, there was still hope. The survivors before him, these strangers, had found a way to endure. Maybe they had the answers Daniel and his family needed. Finally, they reached an old, rusted iron gate, half hidden behind a wall of ivy and overgrown plants. The woman with the baseball bat gave the gate a quick glance, then stepped forward to pull it open. The hinges creaked loudly, and Daniel winced at the noise. But there was no turning back now. This is it, the man said, his voice gravelly. He turned to look at Daniel, his eyes narrowing slightly. Once we're inside, keep your voices down. The shelter's only safe if we stay quiet. Without another word, the family slipped through the gate, entering what appeared to be a large, walled-off compound. The area inside was filled with a mixture of old, makeshift tents and fortified structures. There were signs of life, people moving between the buildings, some standing watch while others gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. Daniel couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over him as they crossed into the compound. It wasn't much, but it was a haven in the midst of chaos. For the first time in what felt like forever, they weren't completely alone. Stay close, the woman said, leading them deeper into the compound. She waved to a man standing guard at the entrance. He nodded back, keeping his eyes on the newcomers. As they walked past, Daniel noticed several other armed individuals standing near the tents, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. This place wasn't as peaceful as it appeared. They reached the center of the compound, where a large tent had been set up. Inside, there were several people sitting around a fire, their faces weary but alive. The firelight flickered in their eyes as they looked up at the new arrivals, their expressions guarded but not unfriendly. Sarah, Emily, Ben, sit down, Daniel said softly. He gestured toward an empty space near the fire, and his family sat down, the tension in their bodies slowly ebbing as they settled. The woman with the baseball bat gave them a curt nod. I'll go speak to the others. Stay here. We'll figure out what to do next. As she walked off, the man with the crowbar took a seat across from them. He didn't speak at first, simply eyeing them with a mix of curiosity and caution. Daniel didn't mind the silence. It gave him time to think, time to regroup. The fire crackled, its warmth comforting after the cold of the city streets. Daniel allowed himself a brief moment of relaxation. He looked at Sarah, who had her arm around Emily, trying to reassure her. Ben was quietly playing with a small toy he had found somewhere along the way, oblivious to the gravity of their situation. "So," Daniel finally said, breaking the silence. "What's your name?" The man glanced up, his eyes meeting Daniel's. "Jake," he said, his voice steady. "And you're Daniel, right?" "That's right," Daniel replied. "And this is my family. We've been trying to survive in this city for weeks now. Didn't expect to find anyone else out here." Jake nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly as though considering Daniel's words. "Yeah, the city's been hell. We've been holed up here for a while, but it's only a matter of time before they find this place too. We've got food, supplies, and a little bit of ammunition, but it's not enough. We need to get out of here." Daniel's mind raced as he processed Jake's words. This place was safe, for now. But the fact that they were talking about leaving meant something had changed. The undead had grown in number, or perhaps their safety here had been compromised. Either way, it didn't sound like there were many options left. "Where are you going?" Daniel asked, his tone measured. "We're looking for a way out too. Something more permanent." Jake hesitated before answering. "There's a group further north. A community that's managed to stay hidden. They've got walls, food, the works. But it's a dangerous trek. We've been considering making a move, but not without a solid plan." Daniel looked over at his family, taking in their exhausted faces. Emily and Ben were both trying to hide their fear, but it was evident. Sarah's hand tightened around his, her eyes questioning. She trusted him, and that trust weighed heavily on him. "We'll go," Daniel said after a long pause. "If you're heading north, we'll follow. We don't have anywhere else to go." Jake nodded, his gaze steady. "I figured as much. We'll leave in the morning. Get some rest tonight. We'll need all the energy we can muster." As night settled around them, the camp became quieter. The fire flickered low, casting long shadows across the faces of those gathered. Daniel lay down next to Sarah, his thoughts racing. Tomorrow would be a new day, but it would also bring new challenges. They couldn't afford to take anything for granted. The undead were relentless, and the world outside was more dangerous than ever. But for tonight, at least, they were safe. The next morning came too soon. The warmth of the fire had faded, replaced by the cold bite of reality. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the compound as Daniel stirred from his fitful sleep. He hadn't slept well, the thought of the journey ahead gnawed at him, and every creak of the tents, every faint noise outside, kept him on edge. The world felt alive with danger, and it was getting harder to ignore. Sarah had been awake before him, quietly speaking to Emily and Ben, trying to keep their spirits up despite the uncertainty. Emily was clutching her stuffed animal tightly, her eyes wide with worry, while Ben fiddled with a small rock, clearly unsettled by the constant change of scenery. As Daniel rose, he stretched and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the exhaustion that clung to him like a heavy weight. His mind was still sharp, but his body was growing weary. The days were blending together in an endless series of survival tactics, hiding, running, fighting for every breath. He knew they couldn't keep doing this forever. Across the camp, Jake was speaking with a few others, some survivors from the shelter who had gathered to discuss the plan for the day. The group was ready, packing what little they had left before the trek north. There was no guarantee they would make it, no promise of safety in the community they sought, but there was no other option. This was their chance. "Everything's packed," Jake called out to Daniel as he approached. His voice was steady, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, fear, perhaps, or the burden of leadership. "We leave in an hour. Gather your things." Daniel nodded, motioning for his family to come over. As they packed up, he couldn't help but feel a pang of fear. They were leaving behind the only place that had felt remotely safe in weeks. The walls of the compound were familiar, a temporary comfort in a world that had become anything but. The group of survivors gathered near the entrance, where Jake and the woman with the baseball bat, who had introduced herself as Lisa, were waiting. Their faces were grim, set with resolve. Daniel exchanged a quick look with Sarah. Her eyes were tired, but she nodded as if to say, "We'll make it through this." "We've got to stick together," Jake said, his voice low. "No one breaks away. No stragglers. And stay quiet. We don't know what's waiting out there." He turned to Lisa, and they exchanged a brief glance, the unspoken understanding between them clear. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. They had no idea what lay ahead, but he had no choice. He had to trust them, and he had to trust his family. They had survived this long, and they could survive this, too. They stepped out of the compound, passing the rusted iron gate and into the eerily quiet streets. The air was thick with tension, the silence oppressive. As they walked, Daniel noticed the city had changed. It had always been a shell of its former self, but now it felt different, emptier, more haunted. Every abandoned vehicle, every overturned crate, was a potential hiding place for the undead. The group moved slowly, hugging the buildings and staying out of sight. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as they passed each intersection, every corner, and every alley. The smell of decay was still heavy in the air, a constant reminder of what had happened to the world. His eyes scanned every shadow, every movement. It felt like the undead were waiting, lurking, just beyond their sight. Lisa was at the front now, her bat gripped tightly in her hand, her eyes darting from side to side. Jake followed closely behind her, holding his crowbar in a firm grip. Daniel stayed near the rear, watching over his family, making sure they were staying close. "Stay alert," Jake muttered. "There's a warehouse up ahead. We'll rest there for a bit, and then push forward." They continued, the sound of their footsteps muted by the wreckage around them. It felt like a dream, walking through this once thriving city, now a ghost town, its streets empty but for the danger lurking in every corner. The only sign of life came from the occasional scurrying rat or the distant groan of an undead, but those sounds were getting closer. Suddenly, there was a sharp noise, a crash from behind them. Daniel whipped around, his heart racing. A group of undead had stumbled into view from an alleyway, drawn by the sound. "Run!" Jake shouted, his voice full of urgency. "Now!" Without hesitation, the group broke into a sprint. Daniel's mind was a blur as he grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling Emily and Ben along with him. They darted down an alley, weaving through debris, the sounds of the undead growing louder behind them. The street ahead was blocked by a collapsed building, forcing them to veer off into a narrow passage between two buildings. Their lungs burned as they ran, the heavy weight of fear pushing them forward. The undead weren't far behind, their grotesque forms stumbling and groaning, lurching in their direction. Daniel's thoughts raced, "Don't look back. Keep running. Stay alive." They reached the warehouse just as the undead closed in, stumbling into the shadows just before the creatures could spot them. They quickly ducked inside the dilapidated structure, gasping for breath. Daniel's chest heaved, and he glanced around the room, taking in their surroundings. The warehouse was dark, filled with the smell of rust and mold. A few boxes and old equipment lay scattered about, evidence of its previous use. Jake, Lisa, and the others were already taking cover, huddled near the far wall. Daniel ushered his family inside and motioned for them to stay down. For a few moments, there was nothing but silence. They had escaped, this time. But the sound of the undead's growls and scrapes against the building walls reminded them that they were not safe. "Not yet." "That was too close," Daniel muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We can't keep running like this." Jake nodded grimly, his eyes narrowed. "No. We need a better plan if we're going to make it north." But the reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. The road ahead was long, and they would be lucky to survive it. Each step forward meant more danger, more uncertainty. But Daniel knew that staying here wasn't an option. They had to keep moving. His gaze shifted to Sarah, who was holding Emily and Ben close. They were exhausted, but they were alive. "Let's rest for now," Daniel said, his voice low but resolute. We'll move again at sunset. We can't afford to waste any more time. As the group huddled in the shadow of the warehouse, Daniel couldn't help but wonder, how much longer could they keep running? As the sun dipped below the horizon, the warehouse was enveloped in an eerie darkness. The flickering shadows cast by the setting sun stretched long across the floor, mixing with the dim, artificial light that seeped through cracks in the broken windows. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with tension. Everyone was silent, save for the occasional rustling as someone adjusted their position or shifted their weight. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in his chest. They had rested long enough, but the comfort of the brief respite was fleeting. Every moment they spent in the warehouse, exposed and vulnerable, felt like a gamble. The undead were never far, always lurking, always waiting for a chance to strike. The noise of their groans and shuffling feet seemed closer than before, echoing faintly through the walls. Are we really doing this? Sarah's voice cut through the silence, barely above a whisper. Daniel turned to look at her, meeting her gaze. Her eyes were tired, haunted by the days of uncertainty, but there was still a flicker of determination in them. She hadn't asked for this life, none of them had, but they had all been forced into it, pushed beyond their limits. We don't have a choice, he said softly. We have to keep moving. The longer we wait here, the more dangerous it becomes. I know, Sarah replied, her voice tinged with worry. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Daniel nodded, understanding. It was the same for all of them. But there was no time to dwell on it. They had made it this far, and they would make it further. Get ready, Jake called out from the corner of the warehouse. His voice was sharp, commanding. We move out in 5. The group had been silently preparing for the journey ahead, collecting what little supplies they had left and checking their weapons. Lisa stood near the entrance, her bat in hand, her posture tense but alert. Daniel's family gathered their things, preparing to leave the relative safety of the warehouse. Ben clung to Sarah's side, his little hand tightly grasping her jacket. Emily, her face pale and drawn, stood quietly next to him, staring at the floor. We'll get through this, Daniel murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. The group was ready. The path north awaited them, an uncertain, perilous journey filled with danger at every turn. Everyone stay close, Jake warned. Move quietly and stay sharp. They slipped out of the warehouse, the last remnants of sunlight barely visible as it disappeared behind the broken buildings. The city, once bustling with life, now seemed like a place of the dead. Every corner, every alley, felt like it could be the last one they passed. Daniel's heart raced in his chest as they moved in silence, each step a careful calculation. The undead were nearby, their groans drifting through the streets like a constant reminder of the horrors that had overtaken the world. Daniel kept his eyes on the ground, avoiding any sounds that might attract attention. It felt like the walls were closing in, and with each passing second, the tension in the air grew thicker. The group reached a junction in the street. It was quiet, too quiet, and Daniel's instincts screamed that something was wrong. He motioned for the group to halt, his gaze scanning every building, every shadow. Jake was the first to move, his eyes narrowing. Stay here. I'll check it out. Daniel didn't argue. He trusted Jake, but a pit grew in his stomach as he watched the man disappear into the alley ahead. The seconds stretched into eternity as they waited, barely daring to breathe. And then, a shout. A loud, panicked cry. Get down. Jake's voice echoed, followed by the unmistakable sound of a fight. A struggle. The unmistakable noise of the undead closing in. Before Daniel could react, a figure stumbled from the alley, a wild-eyed man who appeared to be running for his life. Behind him, several undead lurched forward, their faces twisted in hunger. Run! Jake's voice rang out from behind them, his urgency unmistakable. Go! The group didn't hesitate. They turned and ran, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the terrifying growls of the undead. Daniel's heart was in his throat as he grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her and the kids along. Behind them, Jake and Lisa fought, their shouts and the clanging of weapons echoing through the streets. Daniel didn't dare look back, he couldn't afford to. They had to move faster, farther, or they would be the next to fall. Over here! Lisa's voice shouted as she appeared from the shadows, waving them toward a narrow passageway between two buildings. The undead were close, too close. Without thinking, Daniel darted toward her, guiding his family into the gap. The undead were right on their heels, but the narrow passage gave them a small advantage. The creatures couldn't move as quickly through the tight space, and the group used the brief moment of safety to regroup. "Keep going!" Jake shouted as he ran up behind them, his crowbar swinging wildly. His face was streaked with sweat, and his clothes were torn, but he was alive. The narrow passage led them to a street that was far quieter than the others. The undead seemed to have been distracted by the earlier chaos, and for the first time since they had entered the city, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. "This way," Jake ordered, pointing toward an alley that led deeper into the city. "We're almost there." The group continued at a brisk pace, but Daniel's mind was racing. They had survived the first wave, but the threat was far from over. Every turn, every corner could bring more undead or worse, more people desperate to survive, willing to do anything to stay alive. The road to safety was longer than they had hoped, but they were almost there. The community to the north was still a chance, still something they could aim for. As they moved through the city's ruins, Daniel held on to one thought: keep going. Keep fighting. No matter what. It was the only way they would survive. The end.